Hey there, and welcome back to this video series on Englishes around the world. Today I want to talk about my favorite topic of all time, namely linguistic variation. Variation in language is perhaps the subject where the views of ordinary people differ the most from what linguists think. What's so different? Well, the main difference, I would say, is the belief or the ideology that in language there is right and wrong. There's a correct way of using words and grammar, and then there are many ways of getting it wrong. The key words here, of course, are prescriptivism and descriptivism. A prescriptivist believes that there's a correct way of using language. A descriptivist acknowledges that speakers use language in different ways, and that all of these differences are actually worthy of serious scientific study. As linguists, we want to understand variation because it's deeply connected with interesting social, cultural, and cognitive issues. We'll get to all of that later in this series, but in this video, I want to focus on the topic of variation itself. The ideas that I'll talk about relate to chapter 2 in Edgar Schneider's book, English Around the World. Before we start, however, I would like you to pause this video and reflect on the topic of variation for yourself. I'm sure you've experienced different varieties of English in some way. So perhaps you've been taught English at school or at university, and you've had teachers who were speaking English in a certain way. Now, I can tell you a little story about myself. I remember that as a student, I was watching the movie Seven with Morgan Freeman and Brad Pitt. And I remember thinking, what the hell are they saying? I can't understand a word. Yeah, they sounded nothing like my school teachers. And so I had a pretty difficult time. Anyway, I would like you to pause this video, take a piece of paper and think about how varieties of English can differ from one another. Make a list of points and illustrate your points with concrete examples. Yeah? That can be words, it can be pronunciations, it can be constructions, pretty much anything that you can come up with. Once you feel that you have a good list, continue with the video and you'll find out how your ideas relate to what others think about variation. Okay? So let's go, and I'll continue in 3, 2, 1. Here we go. So to frame the discussion, I'd like to talk about different levels of variation. Language is organized into different layers, and here I'm talking about structural layers. So the sounds of language, the words of language, and the ways in which words are put together. You probably know the technical terms for these layers, so let's take a look at them. First of all, of course, there's variation that's related to sound. And this can be captured under the heading of phonological variation. Phonology is the study of sound systems in language, and varieties of English, of course, differ in the way their sound systems are organized. Then there's lexical variation. Lexical variation concerns differences in the words that speakers use. I'm pretty sure this one is on your list, yeah? Different words that occur only in certain dialects. Then there's morphological variation, and morphological variation has to do with differences in word internal structures. One type of morphological variation that we're going to see a lot in this course is variation in the way grammatical affixes are used. So the little bits and pieces that you find at the end of a word or at the beginning of a word. That's an area that second language learners of English have a lot of trouble with. So I'm talking about the past tense ed ending, or the plural s, or the progressive ing, and so on and so forth. You know what I'm talking about. As you can imagine, different varieties of English make use of these suffixes in different ways, and we'll see some examples of that. We'll also see a lot of syntactic variation. Now, those of you who remember drawing syntactic trees for sentences like Susan read the blue book on the couch, don't look so sad. Yeah? We won't be drawing syntactic trees in this course, and syntax can actually be fun. Yeah? You don't believe me now, but you will believe me eventually, I promise, or I hope. Finally, there's also pragmatic variation. What is pragmatic variation? Well, pragmatics is the study of linguistic meaning in context. And so this concerns processes of understanding how what is said differs from what is meant. We can think of irony, making jokes, avoiding sensitive topics, getting someone to like you or maybe even like you. So this is touchy stuff, and it differs across communities and of course across different varieties of English. Right, so in the rest of this video, what I'll do is I'll go over each of these 5 levels and I'll give you concrete examples for how varieties of English may differ with regard to them. Right, so to get us started, we will listen one more time to a recording of Malaysian English that you already know if you've watched the last video, the introduction to this course. Let's listen to it once more, and this time I would like you to keep your pen and piece of paper and see if you can identify examples of variation at the different levels that I've mentioned. So listen out for phonological variation. Look out for lexical variation, morphological variation, syntactic variation, and who knows, perhaps even pragmatic variation. If you're ready, here we go.
Okay. No, knowledge is not come from vacuum. You have to read, you have to meet with people, you have to have discussion, and in fact, you have to appreciate the differences between your opinion and other opinion. Then it create a thinking, it create a thinking skill, it create something that will generate the new things. Some people may be looking at how coconut falls from a tree, and when we ask them why coconut fall from a tree, maybe he said because it is old enough and ripe enough and it's fall. But if you ask a physicist why coconut fall from a tree, he will say it is because due to gravity. So different person have different perception of falling object. Therefore, having a knowledge about falling object will create you some ideas how we can change, we can transform energy from one form to another form. Basically, knowledge is generator. So if we want to build our nation, if we want to build ourselves, if we want to improve ourselves, there is no other thing other than knowledge. We have to be very, very concerned about development the knowledge.
Let's talk about phonological variation first. Just to start out with some well-known examples of pronunciation variation between British and American English, the word for a muscular old dude in an oversized shirt is sometimes pronounced as God, sometimes as God, and sometimes, if you've been affected by the Northern Cities shift, Gad. Oh my God. Yeah? The world's tastiest substitute for olive oil can be pronounced as butter. Yeah, I would say it like that. Butter or butter, yeah, depending on where you tasted this first. Coming back to our speaker of Malaysian English, there are some examples that I highlighted already in the last video, namely that the speaker sometimes produces monophthongs where speakers of British or American English would use diphthongs. Let me play this to you.
From a tree, maybe he said, from a tree, maybe he said.
Okay, so se instead of say. Here's the other one, which renders basically as basically. Let's listen to this.
Basically, knowledge is generator. So
our speaker also shows dental stopping. Let me play this to you.
It create a thinking skill.
Okay, dental stopping is the realization of an interdental fricative, a th type sound, as an alveolar sound, t. Right, so I think when you listen to the recording, the differences in sound were actually those that stood out the most, yeah? They're the easiest to perceive. But let's move on to lexical variation. Lexical variation is most visible when speakers of different varieties have different names for very common objects or concepts. The example that is here on this slide is the great pop versus soda controversy in American English that many of you will know. Yeah? How do you call a sugary carbonated drink? For some speakers of American English, it's pop, for others it's soda, and for still others it's called Coke. If you've had English at school, there's a good chance that your teacher talked about lexical variation between British English and American English. So they would have mentioned things like lift versus elevator, or of course the classic chips versus crisps. Yeah. But what about our Malaysian speaker? Did you catch anything? So to be honest, the words in this example actually don't reveal much about the variety of this speaker. All the words that this speaker uses, I have in my usage as well, even though I speak a very different variety. So also that is an observation. Lexical words are perhaps the first thing that comes to our mind when we think about language variation, you know, all those funny words that we know from different dialects, but actually they are far from being the most important or the most significant aspect of linguistic variation. Now, let's move on to morphological variation. And here I'm sure that you noticed quite a few differences. Let me pick out just one, namely the absence of third person singular S. Let's listen to the example here.
It creates a thinking skill.
Okay, so the first instance is in it start instead of it starts. The third person singular S is missing. It's not there from the perspective of, let's say, standard British English. And it's the same thing in the two instances of create here. It create a thinking, it create a thinking skill, both times without the present tense singular S. So the absence is systematic. It's a feature of Malaysian English, and it's actually a feature of many different varieties of English. Creoles, Pidgins, high contact L1 varieties, and L2 learner varieties, of which Malaysian English is one. So what you see here is a map from the E-Wave, the electronic world atlas of varieties of English. And in the next video, I'll show you how to work with that interesting resource. For now, let's check out syntactic variation. Did you find anything in the recording? Well, there's one example in the very first line that I'd like to talk about, namely, knowledge is not come from vacuum. Let's listen to this.
No, knowledge is not come from vacuum.
Okay, think about it for a minute. Instead of what the speaker says, what would you say? You'd probably say that knowledge does not come from a vacuum. So with negated sentences, chances are that the variety of English that you have learned has what we call do support. So you use the verb do before the negative marker not. Again, this is something that is realized differently in Malaysian English. I'm coming to pragmatic variation. And here, I would actually like to ask you to reflect on your own experience and your own intuitions. Let's take as an example the way you address a teacher or a professor. What do you say when you talk to them? Do you use their first name? I tell my students to do that, but then again, many of my colleagues don't. So this creates some confusion, and some of my students actually find it embarrassing to call me Martin. So instead they say something like dear professor or dear teacher, and that always makes me smile a bit. Another example of pragmatic variation would be the use of humor across different situations. In what situations is it okay to say something that is funny or ironical? Again, I have some colleagues that are super serious and they have never made a joke in their entire life. But then again, there are some cultures where humor is valued much more. So humor is actually taken as a sign that you're connecting and that you're human, and so it's very important. How this plays out across different cultures, across different communities, is a topic of interest that relates to pragmatic variation. Right, so this brings me back to the 5 levels of variation in language. Phonological variation, which concerns how speakers pronounce their words. Lexical variation, which concerns the words that speakers use and the specificity of these words to certain varieties. Morphological variation I've presented as variation in how speakers use word endings. I've talked about grammatical word endings, but we can also consider derivational morphology here. Fourth is syntactic variation, the fact that speakers across different varieties use different syntactic constructions. And pragmatic variation concerns the fact that speakers across different communities behave differently in conversation. Right, so in the last part of this video, I want to talk a little bit about variation across speakers and variation within speakers. Up to this point, I've essentially been discussing variation across speakers. Speakers of American English do this, speakers of British English do that, our speaker of Malaysian English does this. Yeah, it's true, of course, that there are differences across these varieties and that each variety can be characterized in terms of features that make it more or less unique. However, things are more complicated than that because there is not only variation across speakers, there's also variation within speakers. Everyone who is speaking a language speaks, in fact, several versions of it. We have different registers, different ways of using our languages, and this varies depending on who we're with and who we're talking to. An important concept that I need to mention here is the sociolinguistic variable, which allows us to talk about speaker internal variation with a bit more precision. Basically, a sociolinguistic variable is a linguistic category that can be realized in 2 or more different ways. Informally speaking, we have 2 ways of saying the same thing. Now, what is socio about sociolinguistic variables? Well, typically, the social context determines whether speakers choose one thing or the other. That means that language variation is to a large extent driven by social factors such as your age or your gender, your sexual orientation, or your general outlook on life. Sociolinguistic variables exist on the 5 different levels of variation that I've discussed earlier. Here on this slide, I just mentioned 3 of them, namely phonology, morphology, and syntax. So a phonological sociolinguistic variable would be post-vocalic R, which we have in car, but not in ka. Yeah? Which one you choose, which one you realize, that says something about your social identity. We also have variables in morphology. So the example of Malaysian English that we saw earlier, yeah, the absence of third person singular S, the difference between it creates and it create, that is another important variable. In syntax, we have the difference between the way you introduce quotations. Do you say, I said, okay? Or do you say, I was like, okay? Yeah? Which one of these you choose says something about who you're hanging out with. Sociolinguistic variables often represent a binary choice, so that speakers can do one thing or the other. However, it is rarely the case that a speaker goes for one variant 100% of the time. That is, there is speaker internal variation. Speakers sometimes produce one variant and sometimes another, and a lot of this variation is conditioned by social factors, the social contexts in which the speaker finds themselves. So speakers cannot be cleanly divided into discrete categories, but rather they have to be placed somewhere along a continuum so that they are more likely to use one level of the sociolinguistic variable rather than another. Right. I would like to finish this video with an example of speaker internal variation in the domain of phonology. For that, let's listen to another recording that you may remember from the last video. So here we go. This is the transcript, and you see that I highlighted 3 words, namely easy, pleased, and again, easy. I would like to ask you to listen out carefully for those words. If you have a set of good headphones, now would be the time to put them on. And I'm going to press play here.
In the years in which I've served as Prime Minister, predominantly I have faced a minority parliament and I've also faced internal division within my political party. It has not been an easy environment to work in. But I am pleased that in this environment, which wasn't easy, I have prevailed to ensure that this country is made stronger and smarter and fairer for the future.
Okay. Do you remember where this speaker is coming from? Australian English. We'll analyze this in a second, but for now we can probably agree that the speaker does something that sounds different from me when I say the words easy or pleased. Yeah? I produce what is called a high front vowel E. Linguists also call this vowel the fleece vowel. So what you see here is a vowel chart that shows you the names and relative positions of different English vowels. You see the fleece vowel right up here. It is next to the kit vowel. Further down we have the face vowel, the dress vowel, and then down below we have the trap vowel, the strut vowel, the palm vowel. And if we move from the top back down, here on the back side of the vowel chart, we start with goose, then go down to foot, further down to goat, to lot, and we're back at palm. Right, so the way the vowels are organized, we can differentiate between high vowels, mid vowels, and low vowels, and we can differentiate between front vowels and back vowels. And the vowel that we're particularly interested in right now is the high front vowel that is called the fleece vowel. Right, so fleece is a high front vowel, but our speaker realizes it in such a way that the vowel starts actually as a mid front vowel. Let's listen to the relevant words once more. Here we go.
Easy, easy, please, please, easy, easy.
Okay, so you can hear that the speaker doesn't just produce an E, but rather it starts out with an eh type sound that then glides up to the E. So what we end up having is something like a diphthong. Yeah. However, there's a complication. When you listen to the three words, you actually notice that they are not completely identical. Each of them sounds a little different. Yeah. And this is speaker internal variation. Let's turn to a professional resource, namely the Handbook of Varieties of English. I will talk about this resource in more detail in later videos. In this volume, we actually find a description of Australian vowels, and among them, a description of the Australian fleece vowel. Let me zoom into that. So the handbook recognizes that there is variation in the fleece vowel. What it says is that it's a long high front vowel with an on-glide. The latter two are very commonly heard in Australian English with a continuum of realizations varying from slight on-glide to full diphthongization. Okay, so the same speaker will realize this sound a little differently in different words. That doesn't make our job as linguists any easier, but it is nonetheless important to realize. Okay, let me recap what this video was about. I hope to have given you a first taste of how varieties of English can differ, and I hope you agree that dividing variation up into the linguistic layers in which we can observe them makes a lot of sense. Yeah? In the next videos, we'll continue to explore variation across phonology, lexis, morphology, syntax, and pragmatics, and I hope you'll join me for the ride. If you know me, you know that I'm a bit of a grammar geek, so we'll do a couple of deep dives into morphological and syntactic variation. Right, the next video will in fact be on grammatical variation and varieties of English and how we can explore them through the Electronic World Atlas of Varieties of English. I hope you join me for that. Until then, have a good time and bye-bye.